Welcome to this week's episode of Coffee with the Journalist. And it's a podcast that's just that. We got coffee, we got journalists, we got lots of good conversation. I'm Jared Martin. I'm the co-founder and COO at One Pitch.
And I'm Beck Bamberger. I'm also the co-founder of One Pitch, the CEO of BAM Communications, and the host for today's podcast. Today we're talking to Dave Lee. He's from the BBC. And what's interesting with Dave's role is, despite the BBC being one of the, if not the largest media organization in the world, thousands of people work for the BBC. He talks about how his job is all and only focused on everything technology related coming out of San Francisco. That is quite the task, and he's going to tell us about how he does that. Dave Lee, thank you for being on Coffee with the Journalists, as we like to call it. You're not drinking coffee. It's totally fine. But we're here on a cloudy San Francisco day, par for the course, and it's nice and cozy, and here we are.
Thanks for having me. We finally got it scheduled.
Found
the time, yeah.
Got it scheduled. Well, you're quite all over the world, as it seems, because you're with the BBC, and I definitely want to talk about how is it being a Brit, being headquartered in San Francisco, covering this crazy scene called Silicon Valley. But we'll get into that. We're going to get into that. First off, can we talk about this student paper that you made back in the day, founding editor of, let me make sure I have this right, The Link, the university's student newspaper. So let's go back to college days on what you were doing there.
So The Link, which is spelled Linc.
Yes, make sure.
Very, very clever, because it was from the University of Lincoln. And the journalism school I went to was based there, and they didn't have a student newspaper, which is
How is
criminal.
that possible?
Well, it was too new. There was a magazine that wasn't, particularly well regarded, and so me and a couple of friends, we made the pitch, got the money together, and made this newspaper, The Link. And you know what? Even to this day, it's the most fun I've had doing.
Really?
Because we started off, the first issue was a broadsheet in tone. And it was dull. It was really, really dull. No one wanted to read it. And then we decided quite quickly that the way to do this was to go full tabloid and do lots of sport. And sport was the big thing. We put the football team on the back of the paper every week. And it meant that most people would pick it up on the basis of that. Much like a real newspaper, actually.
Yeah,
doing
actually.
that kind of stuff. And we just had fun with it. And we had this wonderful, the very, very last issue, we got these drugs testing kits. And we went around to all the faculty buildings, including where the vice chancellor or the dean, I guess you'd call it here, was, and we tested the surfaces in various various toilets. And our headline on my last issue as the editor was "Campus on Crack," which caused all sorts of problems. But anyway, yeah, that was the beginnings, I guess.
Campus on Crack.
Yeah, we had a big battle. The administration of the university were removing our stands with the newspaper in. So we were then putting them back, and it was. I kind of wish that social media had been a bigger deal, because we had clips of us doing these cat and mouse games where we'd be putting the stands out, they'd be taking them away. It was very, very fun. Yeah. And the story was good. That was the interesting thing. The story was solid. It changed
Wow.
things, so, yeah.
Huh. Well, I mean, that is fun. I'm sure you're not talking at that level today, and you're almost 10 years at BBC, but we will get into that. So,
mischief is still a theme.
Mischief, yes. Okay. 2008, you graduate from University of Lincoln, which, just to educate everybody, is where? UK.
That's in the UK, yeah.
Yep.
It's slightly north. Mm-hmm. People above Lincoln say it's not in the north. People below Lincoln say it is in the north. It's
Got it.
Bone of contention, but yeah, in England.
And you had some class honors, I see, from journalism. Great. How'd you get over here, across the pond?
So the BBC has for some time now had one position in Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley reporter. The first person who had that is a great woman called Maggie Shields, who now is on the communications team at Google. And then she was followed some years later by a man called Richard Taylor, who's still based out here as well. He's now like an independent video journalist. And the idea has always just been to have one person out here. And I'd been on the BBC tech team for 3 to 4 years, maybe something like that, 4 years. And I'd kind of reached my point of, well, I need to change what I'm doing, not because I was particularly unhappy, but because there's a structure at the BBC, there were more journalists that were more senior to me, and there was a feeling I had personally that if I had a good story, if it got too good, it would no longer be my story, right? So I had to sort of swallow that, which is you can do for a short while, but then eventually you think, you know what, I need to make a change. And when I was having this, I was pouring my heart out to my managing editor at the time, and he said, well, just sit tight because in a few months this Silicon Valley job's going to come up, and if you play your cards right and impress when you do your interview, then there's a good chance you'll get it. And that's how I came here, and that was in July 2015, so 3.5 years ago or so.
And before that, what type of reporting were you doing compared to now, Silicon Valley Beat?
Yeah, I mean, it was heavily tech. I mean, my first ever paid commission was with The Guardian. A man called Charles Arthur, who was their tech editor, he gave me I wrote a story about how I used to work at a Staples store, the office supply people. There was a piece in The Guardian about how useless computer salespeople were in those shops because they didn't know what they're talking about. And I said, well, of course we don't know what we're talking about because we're being paid £6 an hour, and I couldn't care less whether someone got the right computer, frankly. I mean, I tried my best, but it wasn't the end of the world. And so I wrote this piece about that, and Charles, to his credit, treated me like a journalist as opposed to just some guy that wanted to write for the newspaper, and he paid me, and from that moment on, I kind of dined out on this. I'm a technology reporter who has written for The Guardian, and that opened up many different things. And then from there, it was a case of, I was still at university at that time, but after that, I was just freelancing as much as I could, more stuff for The Guardian. I worked a short time with the Evening Standard, a newspaper in London, really, really good newspaper in London. I worked for a short time with Sky News, doing sort of just general news stuff. A lot of it was writing, no broadcast there.
And you were also a tutorer?
Yes.
What is this thing?
Yeah.
I'm looking here.
Do you know
26 students for 6 weeks. Oh, okay. Mentored. Tell it. You don't usually see people who say tutor. I look at everything, Dave.
This is everything. The LinkedIn profile that I'm now wondering how well I've kept,
well, we need to update here.
So I was. I mean, this was one of the things I had a huge amount of fun with, and in fact, the reason why I didn't spring to mind is because it almost felt like an alternate reality. It was in New Zealand, in Wellington, and I while I was at university, I'd been writing a blog about student media and technology and how those things kind of meet in the middle. And a man called Jim Tucker, who was formerly an editor of their national newspaper in New Zealand, one of the national newspapers, he wrote to me and said, would you like to come out for a little while and be a kind of assistant tutor to him and teach students at this college how to be multimedia journalists.
In New Zealand?
In New Zealand, yeah. So I went out there. I stayed with Jim and his wife Lynn, who I now refer to as my Southern Hemisphere parents, such as the relationship we managed to grow. And it was wonderful, yeah. Looking back, I didn't know half as much as I thought I did at that time. And it was a very interesting experience of, knowing when you need experience in an industry before you can teach an industry.
Yeah.
And so that was, at the end of that time, they actually asked if I wanted to carry on for slightly longer. I said, well, no, actually, I want to work. I want to get back to London and do all that. But it was magic. Yeah. Really, 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 really good fun.
Were they college students?
Yes. It was a polytechnic. So it's kind of like
yeah.
So we'd call it a technical college back at
It's
home.
And how do you say the name? Whittemere Community Polytechnic? I don't know.
That's very similar to my
that.
first attempt.
Okay.
It's actually, and it doesn't sound anything like it's written. It's Whitireia.
Oh God. Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't have got that.
And I didn't really get it for quite some time, but it was just the most beautiful place to work. And
New Zealand.
Some years later, when I was working for the BBC, there's this guy called Kim.com. I don't know if you're familiar with Kim.com. Big German guy, lives in New Zealand. Notorious internet guy who was his house was raided by the US for crimes against copyright and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, Jim happened to know this guy Kim, and so several years later, even years after I'd done the work with Jim, knowing that guy meant I could then go back to New Zealand and hang out with this guy Kim.com in his mansion. It was a really fun story.
Kim.com.
Yeah.
Okay. Something for us to research here. Okay, so you go back, you did the mentorship thing, you were at the Evening Standard, you mentioned, and now you've been at the BBC almost 10 years. When is your anniversary there?
I don't know.
Oh, you should ask them.
Is it almost 10 years?
It says it's 10 years,
what's
yes.
that?
So
Nine
you
years
have
and 7
3
months.
more months,
Wow.
apparently. Yeah. And you started out with sports and then you trickled into the tech, even though you said you were doing tech before. So getting at the BBC, I mean, that is a global news outlet. It's creme de la creme. I'm sure they consider themselves the global creme de la creme.
Yes.
How'd you get in there?
Well, see, the strange thing about BBC is that it's technically it's one media organisation, but it runs like a small industry. And in the UK, certainly, it's just this incredibly complex thing. Now, I'd originally applied to be on their traineeship, which is what every journalist wants to do in the country. It's a write-off package. When you're ready, you apply for the traineeship at the BBC.
Is that like an apprenticeship in a sense?
Yeah, it's essentially they have you in for a couple of months. I mean, I didn't get it.
Okay.
The short answer, but they have you in for a while. But the ironic thing is, in the time it took for me to be told I wasn't going to get it, I'd actually met a great guy called Nick Reynolds who ran this blog within the BBC that was essentially about what the BBC was doing with technology. It wasn't journalism per se, but it did offer up this really, really fortunate chance to meet as many people in the BBC as I wanted. And through that, I was then able to go on to work for the World Service, the radio side of our global news, and then eventually onto technology. But it's strange. Sometimes I often talk to students, particularly at my old university, and often they want to have this, how did you get into it story? And I always feel like I frustrate them because I offer this real mash of circumstances. It was of an era as well, because if you're a blogger 10 years ago, you're slightly ahead of the game. If you're a blogger now, you look like you're behind in a way, because it's what everyone's doing. And so the way I came into the industry, particularly into the BBC, you couldn't do it now in the same way. So it was, once you're on the BBC's payroll and you say to an editor, look, I can come in and work for 2 days, you don't have to worry about the admin, I won't invoice you, I'll just be there and I'll bill it, then all of a sudden you find yourself working on all sorts of interesting things, which is what happened.
You get in the ecosystem.
Yes. And I'm looking at my own LinkedIn page here, reminding myself of what I did.
I know.
But one of them, there's a sports reporter, was one of the more fun ones, because that was Saturday afternoons with a newsroom of people just watching the football, basically.
How fun is that?
And we'd write about it, and I was never writing about the big teams, Man United or whoever. I was covering Dagenham and Redbridge versus my team, Cambridge.
Yeah.
It was very fun.
And then you were even doing breaking news, and you had various publications it looks like you worked on. Because one question I think just for people is, and you may not know this off the top of your head, but how big is the BBC in terms of number of employees? Thousands? Hundreds? I mean, it's obviously hundreds.
This is not so much off the top of my head, but something I read in passing, so it may be completely wrong. But my understanding is that we have 10,000 journalists of some description. Now, the phrase journalist in the BBC has a lot of different connotations. Like a journalist could be someone who is cutting bits of audio for a radio show, as opposed to going out and reporting and being what we'd consider, most people consider to be a journalist. But it's absolutely enormous, because there's several...
Wow, look. Okay, so we just pulled up Wikipedia. 20,916, according to 2016 data, is the number of people employed.
So that would be for the BBC in its entirety, yes.
Yes.
And then, of course, on top of that, you have people that are freelancers, you have people... and the BBC's like most broadcasters here, in that they contract the making of programmes out to places. So, it's absolutely enormous. And that's its strength, but it comes with weaknesses. It makes it this enormous ship that sometimes moves slightly slower than we look over at companies like BuzzFeed and think, they're just rolling stuff out and getting it done. We're not quite as nimble. But then I think the flip side of that is that I think people like the BBC being quite slow and steady.
I have to say, I listen to the BBC every day. It's part of my just little routine and my getting ready for work. I just like it. I like all the British accents and everything. And there's nothing and I like the international perspective. So I listen to a couple of international shows and Al Jazeera and a bunch of things. So it's not just American media. But one thing I'm always so impressed by is they'll say, and our correspondent who's based in Egypt right now, and you hear that, and then someone's from Tokyo, and then someone's in some Providence in China on the ground. I mean, there is like the sun does not set on the British Empire and not on the BBC is like how it sounds.
That is very true. I mean, and what I think that's particularly noticeable here, isn't it? When you listen to
hugely
American journalism, as brilliant as some of it is, it's very much about America.
Oh yeah.
And that's indicative, I think, of what Americans want to hear. So that's they're providing what their audience wants. There's a phrase in journalism about making readers eat their greens, i.e. giving them stories that they may not necessarily enjoy, but are essentially good for them. And I think American journalism isn't making Americans eat enough greens.
No, we eat French fries.
Well, it's French fries.
And hamburgers.
That's exactly it.
That's our problem.
So I think the BBC does a better job of that. And I think also what some people don't realise about our output as well is that we don't just broadcast in English. There are, and if any of my bosses hear this, they'll tell me off for not knowing exactly how many there are, but I think around 27 or 28 different languages the BBC broadcasts in. So
wow.
we broadcast in Chinese, in Somali. We have a pidgin service. Now, I didn't know what pidgin is. So pidgin English, which is used in large parts of Africa, and it's this very interestingly kind of the word I'm going to use is mangled, which I don't want it to sound like I'm disparaging it, because it's obviously it's a language that many people use and understand. But what that means is that we're reaching people that aren't being reached by anyone else, and the benefit of that is that feeds into our wider kind of perspective. If you're broadcasting in someone's native language, you get different things from those countries than if you just fly in one afternoon and say, "Oh, we're here, we're the BBC," and then you fly out again the next day. It's the depth of that, I think, is really, really quite something. Yeah.
So as we were mentioning, it's almost been 10 years you've been there. I want to talk now about the beat you cover, the Silicon Valley. And if you look at the array of the topics you talk about, you do all the big companies from the Twitter and Apples to more pontificating on technology's drive in the future and the damage it maybe does and stuff. So how do you do your job being the one person, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like the one beacon of the Silicon Valley correspondent here?
So we're a team of two. I'm the correspondent here, and I work with a woman called Cody Godwin who works with me crewing and so forth. It's weird. I get this quite a lot, not just from outside people interested, but also my own bosses. Like, how are you making your decisions? Because it's always up for debate, I think. Because on the one hand, there are things that are obvious to cover. Apple's launching something. Mm-hmm. Every year we have CES. And then you think, well, is it obvious what we should cover? Do we cover CES? Do we need to cover Apple's new iPhone? Possibly, possibly not. So I think the decisions that I make are just what feels like it's worth looking at the time. And there's inconsistencies with that, and we have to be very careful that if we do cover the iPhone, then we do cover the new Pixel phone or similar from Google and then Samsung and so forth. But I think what it comes down to essentially is, and often when I'm waiting to go on air, I'll hear this in my ear. The presenter will always use a phrase. They'll say, "Oh, here to make sense of it in Silicon Valley is Dave." And I think that's essentially what it is, right? So if there's anything that needs making sense of, whether it's what Apple's doing, why Facebook is in a crisis, even down to why are people leaving scooters outside this building as they are, that's essentially that's the brief as far as I'm concerned. And what's great about that is that that can be a startup with 3 people, or it can be a company with 30,000 people, and it's equally as relevant.
I think that's one of the most unique positions you have, because unlike a lot of the other folks we talk to here on this podcast and just in other newsrooms, you have a dozen or 2 colleagues. You're all here, down the street on Embarcadero or whatever. I mean, you're TechCrunch, you're VentureBeat, you're based here in Silicon Valley, and there's a whole team. You are like the filter of this British Empire for the world of Silicon Valley. I mean, that, like, we're seeing it through your eyes. So I like how they do those intros. I've heard them mention that, and I'm like, that is true, because you have to think that there's some filtering and there's some significant subjective topics that you have to filter by sheer volume, because you can't talk about 700 tech launches every day, let's say.
No. And there's also the kind of internal workings of the industry that I find it hard sometimes to know what's exciting here and what's interesting elsewhere. So, for example, stories about people who Snapchat is a good example, right? Snap rather, they've had a ton of people leave, and that, on many journalists' beat here, rightly so, is a big story. It's an ongoing story. It's one that needs deep reporting. It's one that is worthwhile. But I'm thinking for a global audience, they don't necessarily need to know that. And so sometimes it can be very, very hard. And I'll be on Twitter too much worrying about this.
Yeah.
And my morning routine is like scrolling from a phone and going, oh God, what's happened? Like looking at tech meme and so forth. But sometimes the hardest thing is just to sit there and say, you know what, we're not going to do this. Because we don't have the same kind of sourcing. I don't have the same kind of sourcing that Recode does or The Verge does and so forth. And secondly, you know what? If people want to read about people leaving Snapchat, then there's ample places for that to be read. The stories that I try and focus on are things that we can add something to. Now, whether that's new information, ideally, is in just journalism, obviously, but also this layer of explanation. This is important because, and we have a very high bar now, much higher than we used to, on things like cyber attacks. Now, if there's a hack of some description, we sit back and we go, right, is this a hack that needs to be known by people who read security blogs, or is this a hack that you want your mum to know because she needs to update her phone or a computer or something like that? And that's the tricky decision, and that's much harder here than it ever was in London for me personally, because in London I was probably asleep when some of these stories broke, and B, you just felt much more out of the bubble. So, I mean, that's not to suggest that these other places shouldn't be doing those stories, because they absolutely should. It's just about separating what we should be working on, separate from what the rest of the tech press is doing.
That's so interesting. You have to think from, my global audience. So the Egyptian, the British guy sitting in London right now, and maybe your Chinese consumer, are they going to give a crap about the executive that left Snap or whatever? Yeah, interesting. Then that leads me to ask, and we have a lot of publicists who listen to this podcast particularly, do you get a lot of pitches?
Yes.
Tell us
more. Has anyone ever said no to that question?
No, not at all. Not at all. But I'm just thinking, when you look at your stuff and you're going, you're talking about YouTube and Twitter and Apple and such.
Yeah.
But I know you're probably the only person they can pitch things to. So what happens in those pitches? How's your inbox looking?
My inbox is, I'm not exaggerating here. My inbox says something over 200,000.
No.
Yeah. But
right now, like if you pulled up your phone,
although I can't even believe it. The iPhone doesn't go up that high. It's so right now it says. Hang on, let me find it.
Wait, I'm going to look at his screen. Let me see what it really says.
So here we go. So right now it says 96,000.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
There's not another space for over 100,000.
Well, I've never seen it go much higher than that. Even
wow.
My inbox is going crazy. But I mean, look.
Oh.
Since I've been sat here talking to you, we've got press releases.
Press releases? Oh, the mayor.
Okay. Something about Fortnite and money laundering. I mean, look, there's all these different things. There's you.
Oh, there's me.
So it's I'm on so many Facebook groups. Well, a few Facebook groups where PR people and journalists are kind of interacting. There's one in the UK that is actually pretty good. I quite like it.
Can you tell us which one?
Yeah, it's called Tech JPR or something. It's run by an agency, and I don't know if you know it, but it's one of the more sort of friendly and useful places. And I've popped in there a couple of times and said, does anyone know who's doing press for this or whatever? And often the discussion on that is things like, don't call me, email me, or don't email me, send me a text message or DM me on Twitter or whatever. And it drives me insane when I hear journalists talk like that, because who in their right mind has got the time to know whether someone prefers an email, a phone call, a carrier pigeon or whatever? And my view is, on the flip side, when I hear PR people often say, well, what's the best way to pitch you? I couldn't give a damn how it's pitched, because eventually the good stuff gets through. All Google does when they want to launch something is send me an email, the same way that the email I just showed you there came as an email. So it's not so much how the pitch is, it's just what's in it. And I think it's one of those weird things where we kind of get bogged down in like, do you put this in the subject header? Do you have an email? Do you have an attachment? No, probably not, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. At least not to me. And people, have various different views on this, but I find that kind of stuff, there is I feel like I'm letting the team down now, but I do think there is an arrogance on journalists that think, well, I'm so important because I'm this guy, and therefore you need to bow to my wish on how you send me a pitch. Well, maybe if you're Walt Mossberg, you can say that, but everyone else isn't Walt Mossberg, right? So that's something to deal with. So yeah, I've gone on a bit of a tangent there of that rant, but
no, that's good. We're here to rant.
Yeah, there are lots of pitches, but the fraction of a second it takes me to skim over it, I don't think it's worth getting too worked up about generally.
Now then, let's ask about that. So, those 96,000 emails I just saw, do you go through all? How do you filter the sheer volume?
I scroll through. Well, here's the thing. Ironically, despite my thoughts there, I mean, actually, after doing this job for quite some time, when something's going to be generally in your corner, and it's not necessarily that something's a bad pitch. It would just be that's not what I cover, or that's not what I want to cover right now. Mm-hmm. So if I see a pitch that mentions Fortnite in it, I'm probably not going to.
You're good.
Yeah, because fair enough, you might have an angle on Fortnite. It's not something I'm looking to write about right now. Mm-hmm. I also, and this is a big thing, I do, if I recognise a person's name, I will give that more time. And that's good news for PR people with expense accounts because it shows that it's worth it. But equally, I do like that as a system that, people that I know don't waste my time with stuff is really, really useful. I've had great interactions with PR people at big companies that will email and say, we're putting this out. I don't think it's for you, but just so you know. And I'm thinking, you're not pitching. They're not pitching me at all. They're anti-pitching.
Yeah.
But it means that when the next pitches comes in, they say, oh, we think this is really interesting. Do you want to come in? Then it has more weight. So my filter is the filter is kind of all those different things. I also make sure that all the ones from my bosses go to a folder. So
gotcha. So you don't miss those. Gotcha. Yeah. What now? Getting into the space of transition into media and the current state of media. You've been in this game 10 plus years. You've been with the biggest organization that there is arguably in news. What do you say to people who think or even say, hey, I'm thinking of maybe journalism. I might want to be a writer. What do you think about media? What do you think? What do you say to them?
I'd say, yeah, sure. You can look at something like the newspaper industry, right, and think, well, that's not going anywhere. And you can look particularly at local newspapers and say, well, with local papers closing down, some cities without a newspaper, then that's a terrible industry to be involved in. And that's true to a point. I think it's changing to the extent of, if someone said to me, I want to have the career of someone I admired who worked 20 years ago, I'll say, well, it doesn't exist anymore. And one of the things that is fun if I do talks at my old university, which I do from time to time, is I always like to make the point that if you're in the first year of the course, chances are any job you're thinking about won't exist in that form by the third year. And so you've got to make sure that you're nimble enough to deal with that. And I think that's the thing. If you are willing to say, right, I want to be a journalist, but not be too prescriptive about what that is, then I think you're going to be okay. If you say, I want to work on a local newspaper doing this, then I want to go work at the New York Times as this, and that's going to be my job, you might find yourself disappointed. So I would recommend people to go into the industry because it's great. It's not a real job, is it? It's, we spend the whole time either talking to people, thinking about talking to people, winding people up, finding stuff out, visiting fun places, and one of the great joys of my job is that because it's television, you have to go places. You can't just ring someone up and do it that way. You have to go somewhere, and that's just the greatest thing. So although the industry is changing massively, and it's perhaps you have to kind of maybe work harder and longer and for less money than before, then, well, that's just the reality of it, but it's still brilliant.
We have to end on that note. It's still brilliant. My God. Well, thank you, Dave Lee. I know you have your 96,000 emails to quickly skim by. This has been so great on this cloudy day in San Francisco. Not that that's a new surprise there. And thank you for being here. This was really fun.
That was fun. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening this week to Coffee with the Journalist featuring Dave Lee from the BBC. If you're a journalist who loves coffee or a publicist who loves this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Head to onepitch.co to drop us a line. Until then, let's end bad pitches and start great stories.